In my youth, I was the knockabout Afghan teenager who carried knives. I've been a high-ranking member of an outlaw motorcycle club, the first in the country declared a criminal organisation. I've seen people bashed, stabbed, and shot. I was drawn to places where violence became second nature. Throughout my life, I poured fuel on that fire, but it was only when I left that world that I could see violence for what it is and what led me as a young Muslim man to it, because it's so hard to understand your own motivations when you're in the thick of it. With the blessing of hindsight, I've come to recognise the 4 defining moments that shaped my violent world. The first moment was when we felt like we were no longer regular Australians. At the age of 12, our schoolyard began to segregate between Muslims and non-Muslims. Before, I didn't know much about Islam or Afghanistan, but after 9/11, those labels that apparently defined us started being applied to us. They started to mean something. It felt like the world had now decided we were different. Old friends stopped inviting us to house parties, their parents stopped talking to us about cricket, and my cousins adopted anglicised names. It was like being the suspect of a crime you didn't commit or even understand. We found ourselves under a political spotlight that created a pressure cooker atmosphere. People around us were scared and suspicious, as though we were hiding who we really were. Without a sense of belonging in our environment, we created an abstract identity we were forced to defend. This hybrid identity was based on shallow interpretations of whether we were victims or culprits. Many kids, including myself, began fighting to defend this newfound sense of otherness that was being projected onto us. It became so tied to our identity, we defend it violently if we had to. The second moment was at 17, when the only examples of successful people that looked like me were men who used violence to get there. We had no role models in culture or on screen, so we turned to the places in close proximity where we were overrepresented. In gangs, on the streets. The local thugs rocked Rolex watches and hotted up cars. They became the celebrities of schoolyard gossip. Getting close to them was the only thing that mattered. This cultural dissociation was compounded by the high unemployment rates in our suburbs. In my area, it felt like you could count the number of boys from the 9/11 generation who had white-collar jobs with one hand. In our circles, there were tradies, drug dealers, and radicals. Everything typical Australians had access to seemed just out of reach for us. Being a thug was the easy way out. The third moment came from confusing the concepts of masculinity and empowerment. I remember when a schoolmate got bashed by an older bully and the police wanted to look the other way. One of the local bikies, seeing the injustice, decided to do something about it. The bikie was arrested, as he should have been, but the bully walked away. Bikies knew where they stood. These men had street honour that we could relate to. But street honour, it's a myth. We didn't realise that this honour was a fabrication that has compelled disenchanted people around the world to kill each other. Back then, we were all desperate for a sense of masculine empowerment and thought violence was the only path. Around that time, outlaw motorcycle clubs had patched up young men like me from diverse backgrounds, predominantly Muslims and Pacific Islanders. It was the beginning of the Nike bikie era, a term originally referring to Middle Eastern bikers in New South Wales, where their suburban street culture of Nike runners and diamond-studded watches had replaced the grubby aesthetic of the outlaw biker. We all believed if you didn't fight, you were weak. We idolised the hyper-masculine outlaws who used violence to achieve an end, who did whatever it took to get the job done, even if it was wrong. I was naive and impressionable, and I couldn't see any other view of masculinity other than this narrow version that would run amok in the streets around me. Under the guise of a will to power, I put in work and did some heavy things. There's something scary about being the same person before and after the fact. At the time, it didn't feel wrong, even though so much of what I did was. Suffering was just the currency for living, and violence was the extreme end of what comes from this lack of validation. The fourth moment is more complex. It's wrapped up with history and culture. And it happened when an old friend left Australia to fight for ISIS, to die in some far-off land for some misguided dream. It was then I began to see how violence had trapped so many of us. People often shy away from discussing how history and culture inspires violence, but context is important. Even in Rambo 3, which I'm sure you've seen, an Afghan fighter reminds Stallone of a quote from an ancient enemy that goes, "May God deliver us from the venom of the cobra, the teeth of the tiger, and the vengeance of the Afghan." We all celebrated the Mujahideen's victory over the Russians in the late 80s. Nobody told us 1 million Afghan civilians died in that fight. And here we were, celebrating Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires. We thought being tough and violent was how you survived, a necessary and celebrated part of our own history, our own culture. By 2010, a lot of young Muslims in the West had become disillusioned with their society and fallen under a spell of faith in ways they didn't understand. We call them the Red Hot Brothers. They were obsessed with how they were being treated here in Australia and how their people were being treated overseas. For some, the mirage of a resurrected past, a utopia that welcomed us, was worth dying for. Some believed it was worth killing for. Some took their children with them. That's how desperate they were for the fantasy of belonging and connecting with a past that was long gone. And religious fanaticism became the vehicle to get them there. A vehicle that encouraged death or martyrdom, where the promise of life after death becomes a consolation for the present situation. After my friend died, I began to read the play, and I detached myself from a path that was never really there, away from a violent life. My words are not about justifying violence in any way. It's not to make excuses, and I can't give you all the answers. All I can do is tell you what it's like from the inside, the mistakes that I've made and what I've learned myself. The world likes to package every one of us into neat narratives, but we're all far from neat. We oscillate between our good and bad days, our ugly and pure thoughts, our intricate and hollow judgments. We understand each other about as much as we understand the world, which is very little. By no means does my journey represent all people like me. The world is shimmering with many incredible Muslims and immigrants, forging new paths and representing their communities in inspiring ways. We now have Walid Ali, we now have Mahershala Ali, we now have Malala. But some of us are still struggling, and we need to understand why. A lack of belonging, a lack of opportunity, a confused sense of masculinity, and a warped sense of culture and history. These were the factors that defined me for so long. I think about how life would have been different as a young man if I knew then what I know now. How would the lives of thousands of young Muslim men be different? I spoke earlier about a lack of role models, and yet failed to realize that I had something to offer as one myself. This is why I want to tell my story, why I work as a writer, a journalist, or a filmmaker. It's why I'm preoccupied with becoming the role model I needed to have when I was young. My hope is that by sharing my story, I can start to undo some of the wrongs from my past and open up a new narrative, not just for me, but for other young men.